Brought to you by DK Audio.
DK Audio presents Heads Up Psychology by Marcus Weeks, consulted by Dr. John Mildenhall and read by Sarah Bowes. What is psychology? People are endlessly fascinating. The closer you look, the more complicated you will see that they are. Psychology is a scientific discipline that is devoted to understanding what makes us who we are. By studying our minds and our behaviour, it seeks to unravel the immense rich complexity of being a human. Think of the last time you took a bus or a train. Did you notice anyone else there? Did you strike up a conversation with a fellow passenger? If so, is that because you are naturally outgoing, or was there something particular to that situation that made you speak? You may have wondered why you behave as you do. It is this curiosity about how people behave that drives psychologists, and they ask such questions all the time. Psychology is the study of human behaviour and the mind. But what is the mind? It appears in our everyday speech. I don't mind. I've changed my mind. The mind is not a physical thing, and it is not the same as the brain. It is a concept of a mechanism with a set of abilities or functions. It doesn't matter that we cannot see it, nor can we take it apart to see how it works. Psychologists try to imagine a way that it could possibly work, and watch people to see if their behaviour is consistent with that way of working. But people are difficult to study. The more you try to observe them, the more they change their behaviour. Even so, huge advances have been made in our understanding of things, such as how we form memories, make mistakes, interpret what we see, and communicate with other people. This has allowed us, in turn, to become better teachers, create a fairer justice system, build safer machines, treat mental disorders, and make many other advances. The journey towards understanding mind and behaviour has taken about 140 years so far, but really we are just setting out. Every day, psychologists uncover new and surprising ways in which humans behave. But there is a long way to go before we can say that we truly understand the mind. What do psychologists do? The activities of psychologists are very diverse, and academic psychologists represent only a small proportion of people with psychological qualifications. Psychology can be useful in all sorts of areas where the quality of human behaviour is critical, including sport, education, health, and aviation. In addition, many of the skills psychologists learn are useful in other careers. Academic psychologists. Social psychologist. Social psychologists are interested in how people behave when they are together. They study human interaction, communication, attitudes, friendship, love, and conflict. Cognitive psychologist. By conducting carefully designed experiments, cognitive psychologists seek to define the mechanisms that make up our mind, such as memory, and allow us to behave as we do. Biological psychologist. Also known as neuro or biopsychologists. Biological psychologists use scanners and other high-tech equipment to study the brain and find out about the biological basis of behaviour. Evolutionary psychologist. Studying how our minds have evolved over time allows evolutionary psychologists to understand where abilities such as reasoning and language may have come from. Development psychologist. How do we go from being helpless infants to adults with many abilities? The study of development allows psychologists to see how we build our minds as we grow. Educational psychologist. These psychologists are interested in finding the best way to teach people. They test different theories of education and come up with ways of improving teaching styles. Individual differences psychologists. Individual differences psychologists look at what makes each person unique. These include ideas about personality, emotions, intelligence, identity, and mental health. Medical psychologists. Clinical psychologists. Often based in hospitals, clinical psychologists use a variety of therapies to help people cope with mental disorders, such as depression or schizophrenia. Clinical neuropsychologist. Using therapy, clinical neuropsychologists can help people who have suffered from brain disease or injury to regain the abilities they lost as a result of this brain damage. Counseling psychologist. Using specific counseling methods, these psychologists help people to cope with and overcome challenges in their life, such as bereavement or relationship issues. Applied psychologists. Organizational psychologist. How can a company get the most out of its workers? Organizational psychologists work in industry and help to make people more efficient and happier in their jobs. User experience researcher, designer. Using psychological research techniques, user experience (UX) researchers and designers create websites and software that are indispensable, engaging, and intuitive. Human factors specialist. Most commonly working in the transportation industry, human factors specialists improve the design of signs, controls, and interfaces to improve safety on the roads and in the air. Human resources. Many psychologists work in human resources, where they manage people, including their career progression, appraisals, and any difficulties they may encounter. Research methods. This book contains an overview of some of the most important findings in psychology. You may wonder how the psychologists arrived at their results and theories. Research methods in psychology have become more and more complex over the years, but the basic approach remains the same. Using the correct methods allows psychologists to conduct accurate and reliable research on which to base their theories. Laboratory conditions. Psychologists perform experiments in the laboratory, where they create 2 or more controlled conditions and try to measure the difference in behavior between those conditions. For example, one group of people might be given a caffeinated drink, while another receive a non-caffeinated drink, to test whether or not caffeine affects reaction times. This allows researchers to conclude that the different conditions caused any variations in behavior. Deep and meaningful. Sometimes psychologists are interested in the meaning behind people's behavior and use qualitative techniques to explore topics where their observations are not easily converted into numbers. For example, to investigate the nature of nostalgia, a psychologist might use interviews and open-ended questionnaires to find out more about people's experiences of the sensation. The psychologist can then interpret this subjective material to draw conclusions about human behavior. Statistical analysis. Some of the most powerful evidence in psychology comes from quantitative, numerical methods. Psychologists design a variety of tests to measure and compare people's personalities, for example, and predict how they will behave in the future. This data can be used to construct graphs to show how personality varies by location, for instance. The advantage of using this approach lies in its ability to reveal patterns that may be too subtle to see otherwise. Out in the real world. It is not always possible to obtain meaningful results from a controlled experiment, or by using qualitative techniques such as interviews. In cases where the behavior is dependent on the environment or situation, for example, public transport, psychologists enter the situation and try to analyze behavior systematically. Researchers have to be extremely careful not to interfere in that behavior, or they risk jeopardizing their results. Part 1. What makes me tick? Developmental psychology looks at the way we change throughout our lives and the stages we go through, from birth through childhood and our turbulent teenage years to adulthood and eventually old age. It includes the study of how we acquire skills and knowledge and learn about good and bad behavior. Who needs parents anyway? Mother love in infancy is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. John Bowlby. As small children, we need adults to care for us and provide us with food, warmth and shelter. These caregivers, usually our parents, are also important to our psychological development. We make emotional bonds with them from an early age, which give us the security we need to explore and learn about the world. Forming crucial bonds. While studying the behavior of animals, early 20th century biologist Konrad Lorenz noticed the strong bond between young geese and their mothers. He saw that chicks form an attachment to the first moving thing they see when they hatch. This is usually their mother, but it could also be a foster parent. Lorenz realized that chicks do not learn this behavior. It is an instinctive phenomenon, which he called imprinting. Later, psychologists started to take an interest in the bond between newborn babies and their parents, which they called attachment. One of the first to study attachment, John Bowlby observed children who had been separated from their parents for long periods of time, including child evacuees from World War II. He noticed that many of these children developed intellectual, social, or emotional problems later in life. Bowlby concluded that in the first 24 months of life, children have an essential need to develop a bond with at least one adult caregiver, usually a parent, and most often the mother. Attachment is different from other relationships, as it is a strong and lasting emotional tie with one particular person, which, if disturbed, can have long-term effects on development. Stranger danger. Mary Ainsworth, who worked for a time with Bowlby in London, continued this research. She believed that the attachment figure, the caregiver to whom the infant attaches, provides a secure base from which the child can learn to explore the world. In her strange situation experiment, Ainsworth studied how infants reacted to a stranger, first with their mothers in the room and then without them. The results suggested that there are 3 different types of attachment: secure, anxious resistant, and anxious avoidant. A secure attachment creates a positive template for a child's future relationships. In contrast, evidence suggests that non-securely attached children find it more difficult to form strong relationships later in life. One big family. While Bowlby and Ainsworth stressed the importance of the mother-child relationship, some psychologists believe that an infant can bond with other people and still develop healthily. Michael Rutter showed that infants can form strong attachments to their fathers, siblings, friends, or even to inanimate objects. Bruno Bettelheim also questioned the value of the specific mother-child bond. In a study of an Israeli kibbutz, where children were raised communally away from the family home, he found little evidence of emotional turmoil. In fact, the children often went on to have active social lives and good careers. But critics pointed out that they also tended to form fewer close relationships as adults. Cuddly monkeys. US psychologist Harry Harlow introduced infant monkeys to mothers. Some were padded with cloth, others were left as bare wire, but provided food in a bottle. The monkeys fed from the bottle, but soon went back to the cuddly mother for comfort. This highlighted the importance of meeting a child's emotional needs as well as physical needs. There are 3 types of attachment. Secure. These children are willing to explore and engage with strangers if their mothers are there, but are distressed when they leave and happy to see them return. Anxious resistant. These children avoid strangers and are reluctant to explore. They are very distressed when separated from their mothers and are angry with them on their return. Anxious avoidant. These children largely ignore their mothers when playing, and although distressed when left alone, they can be easily comforted by a stranger. Fact: children with attachment disorders often act younger, both socially and emotionally. Can't you just grow up? A child's mind is fundamentally different to an adult's mind. Jean Piaget. For much of history, children were seen as simply miniature adults, that their minds worked in the same way, but without the same knowledge. It was not until the 20th century that psychologists realized that just as our bodies develop as we grow older, so do our minds. Becoming civilized. A pioneer in the field of developmental psychology, G. Stanley Hall was the first to suggest that our minds develop in distinct stages: childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. After our initial growth as a child, he suggested we go through a turbulent time in our teenage years, when we are self-conscious, sensitive, and reckless, before emerging as what he called a civilized adult. In the 1930s, Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget realized that the early years of childhood are critical. He described 4 stages of mental development, which all children pass through in the same sequence. According to his theory, children can only move on to the next stage on completion of the current stage. Most crucially, Piaget stressed that they do this by exploring the world physically rather than by instruction. By trying things out slowly for themselves, they build up knowledge and skills. Exploring the world. In Piaget's first stage, 0 to 2 years, children learn about things around them through their senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, and they learn how to control the movements of their bodies. In this sensory-motor stage, they become aware of objects and other people, but see everything from their own viewpoint, and cannot understand that others have a different viewpoint. In the pre-operational stage, 2 to 7 years, children learn new skills, such as the ability to move and arrange objects, for example, according to height or colour. They also become aware that other people have their own different thoughts and feelings. In the third concrete operational stage, 7 to 11 years, children can perform more logical operations, but only with physical objects. For instance, they understand that if they pour a liquid from a short, wide glass into a tall, thin one, the amount of liquid stays the same. It is not until the 4th formal operational stage, 11 years onwards, that children move beyond this and become capable of thinking about abstract ideas, such as love, fear, guilt, envy, and right and wrong. Life's pros and cons. Piaget's notion of distinct stages of mental development in children was enormously influential in both psychology and education. Yet some psychologists thought that our development does not end when we become adults, but that we continue to evolve psychologically throughout our lives. In the 1950s, Erik Erikson identified 8 definite stages of psychological development, from infancy to old age. He described this as a sort of ground plan in which each stage is defined by a conflict between positive and negative aspects of our lives, at school or work, and in our relationships with family and friends. For example, at 3 to 6 years, we face a conflict between initiative and guilt. We start to do things the way we want, but we may end up feeling guilty if our actions affect others. At 18 to 35 years, we face intimacy or isolation. We may develop close relationships, but if these fail, we feel lonely. By the final stage, we should feel a sense of achievement, assuming we have experienced the positive aspects of earlier stages. Admiring yourself. In a study designed to measure children's self-awareness, infants aged 6 to 24 months were put in front of a mirror after someone had put a dab of rouge on their noses without them noticing. When asked, "Who's that?" the younger children thought the reflection was another child, but the older children recognized themselves and pointed at the rouge on their noses. This study showed that we develop a sense of self-awareness at about the age of 18 months. As we age, we go through different stages of development. 0 to 1 years. We learn to trust our parents and feel safe, which becomes the basis for our sense of identity. 1 to 3 years. We start to develop independence and willpower by exploring, but we also learn to deal with failure and disapproval. 3 to 6 years. We play more creatively, but learn that we can't do whatever we want, as our actions affect other people. 6 to 12 years. We learn new skills and find out what we are good at, developing our self-confidence. 12 to 18 years. We start to wonder about the purpose of life and our place in society, developing our sense of identity. 18 to 35 years. We develop new intimate relationships and friendships and build on existing ones. 35 to 65 years. We settle down and feel a sense of achievement, perhaps from bringing up children or progressing in a career. 65 plus years. We feel a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment from what we have achieved in life. Fact: the adolescent brain is at a stage of development that makes teenagers take more risks than adults. Can you be moulded? Give me a dozen healthy infants and I'll guarantee to take any one of them at random and train him to become any type of specialist. John B. Watson. We like to think that we're in control of what we do and the choices we make in life. But our behaviour is, to some extent, shaped by what happens to us and our response to those experiences. Some psychologists believe that it is possible to mould people's behaviour and even train people to do just about anything. Stimulus and response. It was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist, who made the first discoveries about how animals can be stimulated to respond in a certain way. Ivan Pavlov was carrying out experiments to measure the amount of saliva dogs secreted during eating, when he noticed that the dogs salivated even when they thought that food was on its way. Intrigued, Pavlov took his investigations further by giving a signal, such as ringing a bell, each time food was provided. He found that the dogs soon learned to associate that sound with food, and after a while their mouths watered every time they heard the signal, even when there was no food. Pavlov explained that the dogs had been conditioned to respond to the bell. When they salivated at the sight of food, this was an unlearned or unconditioned response, but they learned a conditioned response to the stimulus of the bell. This pattern of stimulus and response became known as classical conditioning. We are born as blank slates. A group of psychologists known as behaviorists built on Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning to explain why humans behave the way they do. John B. Watson believed that children are blank slates, that they are born with no knowledge and can be taught anything using classical conditioning. In his opinion, the human emotions of fear, rage, and love are the key to how we behave. He showed that we can be conditioned to give one of these emotional responses in reaction to a stimulus, just as Pavlov's dogs were conditioned to give a physical reaction. But Watson's use of conditioning on humans was controversial, and later psychologists preferred not to try to condition human subjects, especially children. Trial and error. Other behaviorist psychologists continued to experiment with animals, believing that what they learned about animal behavior could be applied to humans. Edward Thorndike devised a series of experiments that showed how cats learn to solve problems. A hungry cat was put into a puzzle box and had to work out how to use a mechanism such as a button or lever to open the box in order to escape and reach its food. Thorndike observed that the cats found the mechanism by trial and error and forgot any actions that weren't successful. He concluded that animals, including humans, learn by making links between actions and results. He emphasized that success or reward reinforces these links, which are further strengthened by repetition of the action. Edwin Guthrie also studied animals in puzzle boxes and agreed that they learned to associate an action with a reward. Unlike Thorndike, however, Guthrie asserted that there was no need for any repetition of the action to reinforce the learning. He explained this using the example of a rat that has discovered a source of food. Once a rat has visited our grain sack, we can plan on its return. Little Albert. John B. Watson conducted several controversial experiments on a 9-month-old child, little Albert, making him associate the appearance of a white rat and other white furry things with terrifying loud noises. Albert became conditioned to be afraid of anything white and furry. It is now considered unethical to experiment on human subjects in this way, as it can lead to long-term trauma. Career choice. John B. Watson believed that all babies are born knowing nothing, but that any child's path in life, including his or her future career, could be controlled through conditioning. Fact. Following in Ivan Pavlov's footsteps, many dog trainers use classical conditioning to train their pets. You don't need no education. The art of raising challenging questions is easily as important as the art of giving clear answers. Jerome Bruner. The goal of education is to create men and women who are capable of doing new things. Jean Piaget. Traditionally, learning was seen as simply a matter of memorizing information. But as psychologists examined the way we learn things, ideas about education changed. They found that learning by rote or repetition is not the best method. We do need to study, but how we study is very important too. Making it stick. The way we learn things and how our memories work are of great interest to psychologists. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a 19th century pioneer of psychology, studied memory and found that the longer and more often we spend time memorizing something, the better we remember it. This confirmed the idea that to learn something well, we should study hard and often. A century later, behaviorist psychologists suggested that we learn by experience, and that when we do something that is rewarded, we remember and can repeat it. Some of the behaviorists, including Edward Thorndike and B.F. Skinner, also emphasized the importance of reinforcing that learning by repetition, going over what you have learned to make it stick. Unlike Ebbinghaus, however, Skinner stressed that there should be some sort of reward for every successful repetition. He invented a teaching machine, which gave feedback to students in the form of praise for correct answers, but asked them to repeat questions that they answered incorrectly. Understanding is key to learning. But even Ebbinghaus realized that there is much more to learning something thoroughly than simply repeating it. He found that we remember things much better if they have some significance or meaning to us. Later, psychologists returned to this idea. They approached it from the point of view of what is going on in our minds as we learn, rather than how things can be made to stick in our memories. Since Ebbinghaus showed we remember things better if they mean something, psychologists came to believe that we learn by trying to make sense of things. Wolfgang Köhler suggested that in trying to solve problems, we get an insight into the way things work. Edward Tolman went further, suggesting that we each build up a mental map of the world from the ideas we learn. Combining these ideas with his own notion of the mind as a processor of information, Jerome Bruner showed that learning is not a matter of putting information into our memories, but involves a process of thinking and reasoning. To learn something well, we have to understand it first. Do it to learn it. Jean Piaget, however, approached the idea of learning from yet a different angle. He saw it in terms of the stages of mental development he had distinguished in children. Children's learning, he said, is a process that changes to fit the limitations of each stage of development. He incorporated behaviorist ideas about children learning through trial and error, especially in the early stages, with the cognitive idea of learning by making sense of what we discover. But most importantly, he stressed that education should be child-centered, geared to children's individual needs and abilities, and encouraging children to use their imagination in exploring and understanding the world for themselves. In the early stages, this would take the form of what we regard as play, but from a child's point of view is very serious. And as children get older, learning is most likely to succeed through hands-on experience, rather than learning by rote from a teacher or from books. Peekaboo. According to Piaget, children can only learn things that fit the stage of their development. In a study, Piaget showed a child a toy, which he then hid under a cloth while the child was watching. He found that children older than 8 months knew to look for the toy under the cloth, but that infants younger than 8 months could not understand that the toy was still there, even though it was hidden from view. Hands-on learning. Children of different ages have different needs when it comes to education. Jean Piaget emphasized the importance of practical experience, doing an experiment, for example, or building a model. Fact: playing with colored blocks helps children to learn about geometry and spatial awareness. Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936. The sight of tasty food makes a hungry man's mouth water. Ivan Pavlov. Born in Ryazan, Russia, Ivan Pavlov originally studied to be a priest like his father, but left theological college and moved to St. Petersburg to study science and medical surgery. He became a professor at the Military Medical Academy and later director of the Institute of Experimental Medicine. Although he is best known for being a brilliant physiologist, his work laid the foundations of behaviorist psychology. Dog's dinner. Pavlov is famous for his experiments on salivating dogs. He noticed that the dogs' mouths watered at the prospect of food, what he called an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus. If he rang a bell each time food was presented to the dogs, they came to salivate whenever a bell rang. This process of provoking a specific response with a specific stimulus became known as classical conditioning. Reversing responses. In later experiments, Pavlov showed that conditioning could be reversed. The dogs that had been conditioned to salivate when a bell rang, for example, could unlearn that response if no food was presented to them. He also showed that animals could be conditioned to respond with fear or anxiety if the stimulus was associated with a punishment, such as an electric shock, instead of a reward. Strict conditions. Psychologists were influenced both by Pavlov's discoveries and by the methods he used. True to his training as a scientist, Pavlov conducted his experiments under strict scientific conditions. Psychology was just beginning to emerge as a separate discipline at the end of the 19th century, and by adopting Pavlov's methodical approach, psychologists established the new science of experimental psychology. Speaking out. Pavlov was director of the Institute of Experimental Medicine when the Tsar was overthrown during the Russian Revolution and a communist Soviet Union was established. Even though the government regarded him highly and continued to fund his work, Pavlov detested the communist regime. He was quite open in his criticism and wrote many letters to Soviet leaders to protest against the persecution of Russian intellectuals. Fact: Pavlov was nominated for a Nobel Prize in 4 consecutive years and eventually won the prize for physiology or medicine in 1904. Live and learn. To instruct someone is to teach him to participate in the process. Jerome Bruner. We become ourselves through others. Lev Vygotsky. In the past, it seemed obvious that parents and teachers simply taught young people information and showed them how to do things. But new ideas suggested that children learn by discovering things for themselves. Psychologists have since wondered how much we can learn on our own and whether or not we need to be taught by other people. Young scientists. Jean Piaget was one of the first to question the traditional roles of parents and teachers in educating children. In his view, they should not try to dictate knowledge and skills, but should simply encourage children to learn things by themselves. Piaget believed that children need to explore and be creative on their own in order to learn about the world around them. At its heart, his theory was based on the notion that learning is a personal process, one that each child experiences on its own. A child, he thought, is like a scientist who conducts experiments to see how things work, and learns the principles by observing and understanding the results. These ideas were very influential and inspired the introduction of more child-centered education systems in which children learn from practical activities rather than passive observation. Young apprentices. Piaget's theories were quite revolutionary, and not all psychologists agreed with them. Lev Vygotsky, for example, stressed the importance of other people in a child's education. He believed that teachers should still take an instructive role, constantly guiding pupils on what and how to learn, rather than letting them find out for themselves. He rejected the image of children as scientists making discoveries on their own, and presented the alternative idea of children as apprentices, learning skills and knowledge from other people. Although we do make some discoveries for ourselves, he believed that learning is an interactive process. We absorb values and knowledge from our parents and teachers, and also from our wider culture. We then learn how to use that knowledge and what we have learned for ourselves through experiences with our peers. In the late 20th century, the revival of Vygotsky's ideas led to a shift from child-centered to curriculum-centered teaching, where lessons follow established guidelines. A bit of both. Piaget and Vygotsky presented two apparently opposite theories, but both describe learning as a process in which children are actively involved. An idea that appealed to the cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner. He agreed with Piaget that we are not taught in the traditional sense, but that we acquire knowledge through exploration and discovery, and he agreed that learning is a process that each child must experience for itself. But he also thought, like Vygotsky, that this is a social process, not a solitary occupation. In order to learn, we have to make sense of things through hands-on experience. And doing this with other people helps that process. For Brunner, the role of the instructor, a parent or teacher, is a vital one. Not to tell or show children what they need to know, but to guide them through the learning experience. Today, most educators use a similar balance of formal teaching and hands-on learning. Arranging the furniture. 2 groups of children were asked to put items of furniture into the different rooms of a doll's house. In one group, each child was left to work alone, but in the other group, the children did the tasks with their mothers. When they were asked to repeat the task alone, the children from the second group showed more improvement on their first attempt than the loners. This indicates that children learn best if they are encouraged by an adult. Can we learn things on our own? Yes, we learn things by ourselves by exploring and discovering them, with only guidance and encouragement from parents and teachers. Yes and no. We learn things on our own, but we do this socially with other people, and we need an instructor to show us how to participate in the learning process. No. We have to learn from other people. We need to interact with our peers and the society we are brought up in, and we need instruction and guidance from parents and teachers. Fact: spending time playing in green outdoor spaces may help children to learn creative skills. Fact: after exercise, your body produces a chemical that helps your brain to absorb information. Why did you behave like that? Behavior is shaped by positive and negative reinforcement. B.F. Skinner. As we grow up, we learn not only knowledge and skills, but also the way we behave in everyday life. Some psychologists believe that our behavior is shaped by the approval or disapproval of other people, such as parents and teachers, but others think that we simply imitate what we see other people doing. Rewarding behavior. The experiments of early behaviorist psychologists such as John B. Watson and Edward Thorndike show that animals, including humans, can be conditioned to do things, and led to the belief that our behavior is the result of stimulus and response, or classical conditioning. B.F. Skinner, a later behaviorist, carried out similar studies using rats and pigeons, and showed that they could be trained not only to do things, but also not to do things. He used a type of conditioning called operant conditioning. This involved giving the animals positive reinforcement. Skinner preferred this term to the word reward, in the form of food pellets, when they successfully completed a task, but negative reinforcement, punishment, in the form of electric shocks, when they did something he wanted to train them not to do. Skinner believed operant conditioning could be used to shape children's behavior, for example by praising their achievements. But he was uneasy about punishing undesirable behavior, preferring more positive reinforcement. Although the idea of operant conditioning explains how we can be taught to behave in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily teach us why that behavior is considered desirable or undesirable. Setting an example. Other psychologists suggested that it is not just the way parents, teachers and other caregivers reward or punish us that shapes our behavior. Albert Bandura believed that we learn our behavior by example. Seeing the way other people behave, we notice that there is a pattern to their actions in various situations. We assume that this behavior is normal for each situation, what are known as social and cultural norms. We remember how they behave and rehearse this behavior in our minds so that when we find ourselves in the same situation, we know how to react. This way of modeling behavior, by observing and then imitating other people, was the central idea in what Bandura called social learning theory. Picking up prejudice. Another aspect of social learning is that we pick up attitudes from other people. While that can be a good thing, teaching us about the beliefs that shape our culture, for example, it can also have a negative side. Social attitudes in many societies include prejudices such as racism. In 1940, the husband and wife team of psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, studied the way that segregated African American children and their white counterparts learned attitudes. Both groups of children were presented with a white doll and a black doll, and were asked which doll they preferred. Most children, black and white, chose the white doll, suggesting that they had absorbed from their communities the attitude that black people were inferior to white people, even though for the black children this prejudice was against themselves. Doll bashing. In one of Albert Bandura's experiments, some children watched adults behave aggressively towards a Bobo doll. Another group were shown adults acting passively with the doll, and a control group were shown no adults with the doll. When left alone with the doll, the children who had witnessed aggression also acted violently towards it, but the others didn't. This confirmed Bandura's view that we learn behavior through copying other people. Learning bad habits. Albert Bandura believed that we learn our behavior by copying others. If a child hears an adult use a swear word, for example, it is likely that the child will go on to repeat the offensive word. Fact: we pick up habits at home. Most children watch the same amount of television as their parents. Do you know what's right and wrong? In the simplest of social games, we find rules which have been elaborated by the children alone. Jean Piaget. Morality develops in 6 stages. Lawrence Kohlberg. Learning the difference between good and bad behavior is an important part of growing up. Behaviorists thought that good and bad actions are conditioned by rewards and punishments. But later, psychologists suggested we acquire our sense of right and wrong in distinct stages. Moral teaching. For a long time, it was thought that children's moral development, learning about right and wrong, is determined by teaching. Behaviorist psychologists believed that moral behavior can be shaped by conditioning. Using the idea of stimulus and response, they thought that good behavior could be conditioned by rewards, and bad behavior discouraged by punishment. But others pointed out that most people haven't committed a serious crime and been punished for it, yet they know that murder, for example, is wrong. And although psychologists such as Albert Bandura suggested that we learn by imitating others, children who play aggressive computer games generally don't go on to act criminally, as they know this is wrong. The rules of the game. A large part of Jean Piaget's study of children's development focused on their moral development. He interviewed children of different ages, asking what they thought about morally wrong things such as stealing and lying, and observed them playing games together. Like their psychological development in general, he found that children learn a sense of morality in stages, and, just as he thought they learn best by exploring the world on their own, rather than through instruction from a teacher, he suggested that children develop their ideas of right and wrong, fair and unfair themselves, through their relationships with others of the same age. In games, children make rules that reflect their discoveries about notions of justice, equality, and reciprocity, give and take, quite independently of teachers, parents, or others in authority. Steps in the right direction. About 25 years after Piaget's theory of moral development, Lawrence Kohlberg took the ideas a step further. He agreed that we develop a sense of morality in gradual stages, but felt that authority figures and society in general do have an influence. A sense of morality does not come from the child alone. He also believed that moral development continues beyond childhood through adolescence, following a series of 6 distinct stages. In the first stage, the child is concerned with avoiding punishment, and in the next, he or she realizes that certain behavior can result in a reward. The third stage sees the child trying to conform to what he or she believes is expected, social norms, in order to be regarded as a good boy or girl. In the fourth stage, the child recognizes that there are rules governing behavior laid down by authority figures, such as parents. Moving into adolescence, he or she begins to understand the reasons for rules and social norms, and how his or her behavior affects other people. And in the final stage, he or she forms a moral sense based on principles of justice, equality, and reciprocity. Passing judgment. In one moral development study, children watched a puppet show. A ball was passed to one puppet who sent it back, then passed it to another who ran away with it. The puppets were then put on piles of treats, and each child was asked to take a treat from one of the piles. Most took from the pile of the naughty puppet, and one right-minded 1-year-old also gave the puppet a smack. Good or bad? Psychologists believe that we are not born knowing what's right and wrong, but that we acquire this knowledge as we grow up. Even so, the line between good and bad is not clear-cut. Fact. Alarmingly, studies have shown that 60% of people will lie at least once during a 10-minute conversation. Mary Ainsworth, 1913 to 1999. Attachment is an affection tie that binds one person to another in space and endures over time. Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth is best known for her work on child development, especially mother and child relationships. She was born in Ohio, USA, but was brought up in Canada and studied psychology at the University of Toronto. In 1950, she moved to London with her husband, the British psychologist Leonard Ainsworth, and worked with John Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic. She returned to the USA in 1956 to teach at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Virginia. Recruiting talent. During World War II, Ainsworth served in the Canadian Women's Army Corps and reached the rank of major. There, she interviewed soldiers to select suitable candidates to become officers. This gave her valuable experience in the techniques of interviewing, keeping records, and interpreting results, but also inspired her interest in the psychology of personality development. Time in Africa. In the 1950s, Ainsworth spent a few years in Uganda in Africa, studying the relationships between mothers and their small children in tribal societies. Over a period of up to 9 months, she regularly interviewed mothers with babies aged from 1 month to 2 years old. It was here that she developed her ideas about bonding and attachment, especially the importance of a mother's sensitivity to her child's needs. Strange Situation Experiment. In 1969, Ainsworth conducted an experiment, later called the Strange Situation, to study the different kinds of attachment between a child and its mother. She observed the reactions of a 1-year-old child in a room with toys, first with its mother, then with a stranger as well, then left alone with the stranger, and finally when its mother returned. Different children reacted in various ways depending on the strength of the mother-child relationship. Stay-at-home mums. Ainsworth stressed how important it was for a child to form a secure attachment to a caregiver, but didn't believe that mothers should necessarily have to sacrifice their careers for this. She thought that it was possible for them to combine work and childcare, rather than become full-time stay-at-home mums. She also felt that more research was needed on the role of fathers and the importance of the bond between father and child. Fact. She was an expert in Rorschach tests, a method of assessing personality from the patterns people find in ink blots. Is it never too late? There's been a past and there will be a future, but here we are now. Robert Kastenbaum. As we get older, we go through several stages of development. At the end of our working lives at about the age of 65, we enter a final stage, which in modern times can last for 30 years or more. Old age is often thought of as a period of decline, but it may also be a time for change and new interests. The trouble with old age. Erik Erikson described old age as the last of his 8 stages of development, a time for us to take it easy and look back on the earlier stages of our lives. But since he came up with this idea in the 1950s, attitudes to old age have changed. Many people now live long past their retirement age, so this stage is often seen as a period for further development. Unfortunately, not everybody has the chance to carry on developing in later life. The physical decline of our bodies may prevent us from taking up or continuing with some activities. Some physical problems that occur more often later in life also have a more direct effect on our psychological abilities. A stroke, for example, can damage the brain, causing both physical and mental difficulties. And there are neurodegenerative diseases that impair the brain or nervous system that are particularly associated with old age, such as Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. Older and wiser. We may become less physically able in old age, but our mental abilities do not necessarily deteriorate. Edward Thorndike believed that, unless there is some neurodegenerative disease, our memories show little decline with age, and older people can continue learning almost as well as young people, just not so quickly. Recent tests show that intelligence also remains relatively unaffected. Although our ability to solve new problems may weaken, our knowledge and wisdom may even increase. Therefore, our retirement years may be an ideal time to take up new interests, particularly ones that involve mental activity. These may not prevent any mental decline, but they have been shown to improve the quality of life as a whole. As young as you feel. Although we tend to think of people over a certain age as being just old, there are different stages of old age, and the attitude that old people have towards their age affects the way they live. The psychologist Robert Kastenbaum used a questionnaire called The Ages of Me to show that age can be measured in several different ways. Alongside the participants' actual chronological age, he asked how old they thought their bodies looked to themselves and to other people, their biological age. He also asked what age they would put on their activities, thoughts, opinions and attitudes, their social age, and how old they felt deep down inside, their subjective age. Not surprisingly, most of them felt they were younger than their actual age. Karate Kids. In a study in Germany, a group of people aged between 67 and 93 were given various forms of training. Some did purely mental exercises, others purely physical training, and a third group learned karate. After some months, it was found that the combination of physical and mental training in karate greatly improved participants' emotional well-being and quality of life. The Ages of Me. According to psychologist Robert Kastenbaum, we all have 3 different ages, in addition to our chronological age. Most old people think they look older, but feel younger than they really are. Your subjective age is the age that you feel deep down inside. Most people feel younger than they are. Your social age reflects the activities you enjoy doing and your opinions and attitudes. Your biological age reflects how old you think you look and how old you think other people think you look. Fact: the world's population is getting older. The proportion of people aged 60 or more will double in the next 50 years. Developmental psychology in the real world. As we get older, our behavior and skills change. Developmental psychologists study the stages we go through and what influences our development. Their research has had a huge impact on childcare and education, and has helped to explain certain behaviors by linking them to problems in early life. Older and wiser. We really do get wiser as we get older. Our capacity for making good decisions takes a long time to develop. The frontal lobes in our brains, which are responsible for decision-making, carry on developing until we reach our 20s. So ask a parent or teacher for advice if you are unsure what to do. Superstitious behavior. Some behaviorist psychologists have suggested that accidental reinforcement of a response can lead to superstitious behavior. For example, if you score lots of goals every time you wear a certain pair of socks, you might start to associate wearing the socks with playing well and will wear them for every game. Look who's talking. Babies mimic the babbling of their parents within a few weeks of being born. They also start to recognize language at a very early stage, preferring their parents' speech to that of others. This explains why it is so important for parents to talk to their babies. Hands-on learning. Developmental psychologists have argued that children learn best if they have the freedom to use their imaginations. Montessori schools work on this ideal, and pupils are encouraged to learn independently through hands-on activities and discussion with their peers, rather than instruction from teachers. Feeling secure. Many children's pushchair manufacturers are now selling rear-facing designs, following psychological research that showed the importance of parent-child communication in relieving infant stress. If they can see a parent, children feel secure and are less likely to become distressed. Unhappy homes. Psychologists have found that a bad home environment can damage a child's emotional development, often causing poor academic performance and antisocial behavior that can last well into adulthood. Rehabilitation programs for young offenders often focus on their home lives in order to prevent reoffending. Distant memories. Most people cannot remember anything before the age of 3. This may be because the way we record and retrieve memories changes at this age. Even so, these early years when we bond with our caregivers are crucial to our development, and our experiences at this time can have a lasting impact. Bad influence. Some psychologists have argued that violence in films and video games causes children to become violent themselves. The evidence for this theory is not clear-cut, but concerns have led to the introduction of age ratings for films and games, for example, PG, 12, 18, as a precaution.